So, there are some characteristics of what we would consider a healthy microbiome, right? And so, really, at the end of the day, the features of a healthy microbiome speak to the protective capability of a healthy microbiome against metabolic endotoxemia or postprandial endotoxemia. So let's break down what a healthy microbiome looks like. First feature of a healthy microbiome is increased diversity within the microbiome. The more diverse your gut microbiome is, the healthier you are. And in fact, studies show the longer you will live. The diversity in your microbiome will actually dictate longevity, because diversity in microbiome is inversely correlated with illness, chronic illness, infection, and so on, right? So that's one key factor. We want to increase the diversity of the microbiome. And after I describe each of these features, we'll go through and say how you actually do these things, right? So we need to keep in mind increased diversity in the microbiome is critical. The second part of it is the presence of strains called keystone strains, right? So these are organisms within the microbiota that not only protect the host through a lot of metabolic functions, but also supports and protects the rest of the microbiome. And that's why they're called keystone strains, like a keystone in the arch of a architectural design. It maintains the structure, right? And so these keystone strains maintain the structure of the microbiome. So some of those are like Akkermansia muciniphila, Faecalibacter prosnitzi, Bifidobacterium longum, Rhumnococcus. So there's a number of these keystone strains which are not only critical to the host, but also critical to the microbiome. And lots of studies show are directly inversely correlated with disease. So Akkermansia, for example, if you have high levels of Akkermansia, you're protected against everything under metabolic syndrome, right? So the more the Akkermansia is, the more protected you are. Same with Faecalibacter prosnitzi. You have high levels of Faecalibacter prosnitzi, you're protected against all kinds of inflammatory bowel conditions, starting with IBS, Crohn's, colitis, colorectal cancer, and so on, right? So these are really important species within the gut. These are all anaerobic species. You're not going to find most of them in probiotics. You can't really take them in probiotics because the moment they come out of the body, they're exposed to oxygen. Within 30 seconds, they die. So they're designed to be in the gut, in an anaerobic environment, and they play a really important role there. Then the third feature is the production of certain postbiotics. Things like short-chain fatty acids are really critical to the integrity of the lining of the gut, the inflammatory and immune response in the gut lining, and also all of the metabolic response in the body. Right now, these keystone strains play a big role in the production of short-chain fatty acids, right? But that's another separate thing we should look at as a key feature of a healthy gut. And the last thing is some sort of competitive force within the microbiome to keep opportunistic organisms at low, healthier levels, right? So it is not at all unusual to have pathogens in your gut. We all have pathogens in our gut. It's not at all unusual to have opportunistic organisms in your gut. We all do, all over the body and in our gut as well. But it's that diverse, healthy microbiome that keeps them in check. The moment the diverse, healthy microbiome becomes compromised, then they are allowed to proliferate. And when they proliferate, they start initiating metabolic processes that are not good for the host and not good for the barrier structure. So if we just remember that diversity in the microbiome, increased growth of keystone species, increased production of things like short chain fatty acids, and then a control mechanism for opportunistic and pathogenic organisms. If you have those four features within your gut microbiome, you've got a healthy gut microbiome and you're protected against leaky gut and LPS endotoxemia.
So how, I guess moving into this idea, we've got these four variables. What are some of the things that are within our control that we can, I guess, utilize to modify these four variables?
Yeah, so let's start with the diversity piece. One of the key ways of increasing the diversity within your microbiome is to increase the diversity of your diet, right? So the more diverse your diet is, the more different types of foods you consume, the more diverse your microbiome is. Most of what you eat actually goes to feed your microbiome, right? We digest and assimilate a very small proportion of the food that we eat. Most of it, think of it as feeding your ecosystem on the inside. And that's a big diversity in plant-based foods. diversity in animal-based foods, proteins, carbohydrates, fats, resistant starches. So just trying nuts and seeds. So trying to get a nice little diversity within your system. And again, that's kind of how we evolved, right? Humans did not, through the course of evolution, have the luxury of saying, I'm going to be vegan, or I'm going to be carnivore, or I'm going to be paleo, right? We just had to eat what was available, and we had to eat what we could find, and that was a big diversity in food sources. Some anthropological studies assume that, or estimate that our ancestors consumed upwards of 600 different types of foods annually. You take an average Westerner and may eat about 15, 16 different types of foods, right? So increasing the diversity in our diet is huge. One simple way I always tell people to do is that, we all kind of have our habits of where we shop for our food and so on. If you go once a week to an ethnic grocery store, for example, in my region, we have this store called the H Mart, which is an amazing Asian market that has vegetables and meats and fruits that we would never see at our Whole Foods and the regular grocery stores that we go to. And you just select one thing from that grocery store, whether it's a root, a tuber, a vegetable, cabbage of some sort, and then incorporate that into your diet for that week. You don't have to make a whole meal out of it. You can just chop it up, steam it, saute it, whatever it may be, just add it into your diet. And if each week you add one new thing into your diet and you try to maintain the exposure to those things, you're going to increase the diversity in your diet quite dramatically. So that's one thing you could do. The second thing is counterintuitive, but not feeding the microbiome, right? So a period of fasting actually dramatically can increase diversity within the microbiome. Your microbes within your microbiome are layered into different types of fermenters. You've got primary, secondary, tertiary fermenters that do their job at different times during the day and do their jobs during different parts of the metabolic cycle. So when you first bring in food into your system, all of those large macromolecules are going to be attacked by the primary fermenters, right? And the primary fermenters are going to then digest those and produce secondary metabolites that then feed a whole slew of secondary digesters of fermenters. And then they're going to produce metabolites that feeds another layer of microbes, right? And so that whole process of this cascading of feeding microbes, where they feed each other, it's called cross-feeding within the microbiome, that takes long periods of time. From one meal, it could be 10 hours before the third layer of microbes are actually getting what they need in order to create their metabolic activity. And so if we constantly keep adding food into the system, then it triggers and selects for the primary fermenters for the most part. And then these guys down here at the base hardly get to actuate their metabolic activity, which means they don't get as much growth. They don't get as much representation, as much time to multiply and have their representation within the population, right? So a period of fasting to allow all of this cascade of microbes to go through their metabolic process can be very important. I myself do a daily intermittent fast. I do about a 16-hour fast almost every day, where I stop eating at some point in the evening, 8, 9 o'clock. Then I don't eat my next meal till around noon or 1 o'clock the next day. So I put most of that during the nighttime sleeping time. And then I've just kind of skipped the breakfast and not make my first meal till lunchtime or late lunch. So feeding a diverse, rich diet and then not feeding the microbiome, both of those things are important as well. Another way of increasing diversity is by getting outside. It is pretty clear in the research that the more contact you have with the natural environment, and I don't mean outside as in just walking up and down the sidewalk in your street, right? The more you can go into natural environments, whether it's in our area, forest preserves where you can go by a lake or you walk through, path in the forest preserve, those kind of interactions dramatically increase the diversity in your microbiome because you'll pick up organisms from the environment, and those organisms from the environment will actually stimulate the growth of some of the endogenous species within your gut microbiome as well. Another thing is to reduce exposure of things that are hurting your microbiome, right? So when it comes to food, trying to go organic as much as you can so you get less exposure to things like pesticides and herbicides, which are known to be antibiotics in your gut, which bring down diversity quite dramatically. We did a study with King's College a couple of years ago where we showed that as little as 3 weeks of exposure to environmentally safe levels of Roundup reduced diversity in the microbiome very dramatically. And so imagine if you're getting that exposure every single day through foods that you're eating, it acts as a long-term antibiotic within your microbiome and shrinks your diversity over time quite dramatically, right? So the more you can go towards cleaner food, if you can grow a little bit of your produce in your own garden, that helps a lot because that's a cleaner source of produce. The more you can eat less processed foods, because processed foods will have preservatives, antimicrobials, and all that in there to provide shelf life, right? So the more you can reduce those things, and again, I don't want people to feel overwhelmed like they have to make these big radical changes. It's small changes over time consistently will create profound effects, right? So on the diverse food side, I mentioned just add one thing a week into your diet. On the fasting side, even if you can do 2-3 days of an intermittent fasting a week to start, that's great. If you can get outside once a week, if you can use it like a prescription, meaning, you prescribe yourself 30 minutes once a week to be outside in a natural environment, that in itself can have a huge impact. Then you can go to twice a week, 3 times a week as you build it into your routine. And then as far as your diet changes go, okay, I love eating cereal. I'm going to move from my regular cereal to an organic version, right? A simple single change like that. Or I love eating this category of food. I'm going to look for an organic version of it, like bananas, for example, or some other kind of food, right? So small incremental changes like that. Two more incremental changes that you can make will have a huge impact would be looking at your personal care products. Your personal care products like your lotions and soaps and shampoos and all of those things contain crazy chemicals in it, most of which have not been tested against the microbiome, but many of which will have a negative impact on your microbiome because of the nature of those chemistries, right? So if you can clean up one of your personal care products even, it's going to have a huge impact. For example, don't buy soaps that have antimicrobials in it specifically. You don't need that, right? Soap in itself is inherently an antimicrobial. You don't need soaps with added antimicrobials in it. Buy a clean shampoo, one that has mostly, food-based ingredients, organic ingredients. What I've been focusing on over the last 5 years is finding the cleanest lotion and the cleanest natural deodorant to use, right? Because those are things that will impact my ecosystem. So that's another thing. And then the last thing was your home environment. So your home environment does not need to be sterile. Most surfaces in your home do not need to be Cloroxed and sterilized and have that bleach smell, right? In my house, most of the surfaces we clean using a squirt bottle of water, and I put a couple drops of essential oil just for some smell, and that becomes the surface cleaner. Now, if you bring home a raw chicken, you get raw chicken juice on your countertop, you do want to sterilize that because that can be Salmonella, Campylobacter, and so on. So be smart about it. But most surfaces you do not have to sterilize. That actually has a long-term effect on your microbiome. There's something called the Finnish allergy study, which confirmed that in a long-term study, which showed that homes that use more sterilization, in terms of their cleaning practices, had kids that have higher incidence rate of allergies, viral infections, microbiome dysfunctions, and so on. Right? So trying to keep your home environment less sterile is actually good. So those are a few things you can do to improve the diversity and improve the ecosystem within your microbiome. To increase the growth of the keystone species, right? So let's just focus on 2 keystone species or 3 keystone species that are really important. Akkermansia. Akkermansia plays a really important role in the mucosal structure. Fecalum bacteria, which is highly protective of the gut lining. It reduces inflammatory response in the gut lining and stimulates the rebuilding of the gut lining quite dramatically. And then certain types of bifidobacteria like bifidolongum is really important in improving metabolic and immune response in the gut lining and also rebuilding that mucosal structure, right? So we just take those 3 to focus on. Akkermansia loves polyphenols. So if your diet is rich in polyphenols, or if you can increase polyphenol intake in your diet, then you're doing a great job. The good news is there's some really fun polyphenols like dark chocolate, red wine, a clean red wine. You know, if you can get Italian red wine is pretty clean. If you get California red wine, there's a good chance that there's some pesticides in it. But I think the Tuscan wines tend to be very strict on what they can use in the vineyards, right? And so so those are fun polyphenols, but of course lots of sources of polyphenols come from colored fruits and vegetables and so on. So Akkermansia loves polyphenols, and Akkermansia loves fasting. So you can increase Akkermansia in those two ways. Faecalibacter prosnitzi likes certain types of resistant starches or oligosaccharides. So if you're eating things like kiwi, the pulp in kiwi will feed Faecalibacter prosnitzi. So it likes these resistant starches and these fibers. Bifidobacterium is very similar as well. It really likes resistant starches and complex fibers like oligosaccharides. Now, to make all of that easy, we created this product called Mega Prebiotic. Mega Pre is formulated with these unique oligosaccharide prebiotics that have been clinically shown in published studies to specifically feed those important keystone strains: Akkermansia, Faecalibacter, Bifidolongum, right? So it's 1 scoop a day, and what we see is about 100-fold increase in those keystone species in a 3-week period.
Wow.
We published a study on that in August of 2019. So a very easy and simple way, and you add that to the dietary changes, you'll really be supporting your keystone species. Another way of increasing keystone species, and in fact, starting to seal up the gut, is with the spore-based probiotic. That's why that was our first focus with Megaspore, is we said we want to see if this product can actually create that competitive resistance within the microbiome. It can bring down the growth of some of those opportunistic organisms, and then support the growth of other species within the microbiome, and then also seal up those tight junctions in the intestinal epithelium. And sure enough, we saw in a 30-day study in individuals that had severe leaky gut or metabolic endotoxemia, just by taking the Megaspore alone, not doing any of the other things we talked about, right? Just by taking the Megaspore alone, saw a 60% reduction in the amount of LPS leaking into the circulation every day, right? 60%. That's a massive reduction. And then along with that reduction of LPS, we saw all of those key inflammatory cytokines that I mentioned: interleukin-6, interferon gamma, TNF-alpha, all those reduced quite dramatically as well. And we saw a number of markers that indicated the improvement of the gut-brain communication also, which means that LPS is now being reduced in the brain stem, in the enteric nervous system, and so on. So that was a published study in 2017, and we've since done a couple other studies, one large one that's going on right now to further establish those scientific facts. So the probiotic, the Megaspore in itself, will reduce that metabolic endotoxemia quite dramatically. If you add in the Mega Pre to increase the growth of the keystone species, and then you do some of the things we just talked about, from lifestyle changes and so on, you'll have a profoundly different gut microbiome over a relatively short amount of time, a 2-3 month period.
Amazing. So you actually reminded me, I did have a little question that came into my mind early in regards to the idea of LPS translocating kind of into compartments of the brain. And is that something that, almost like people talk about a body burden of toxins, is it sort of that if we can improve the integrity of the gut lining, the microbiome, this kind of naturally just starts to come back down?
Absolutely. It'll naturally come back down. You'll get that low basal level of LPS leaking in, but your immune system can typically take care of that. You won't get that massive flood, right? That postprandial flood of LPS. Yeah. And it all is dependent on those changes to the microbiome, increasing the diversity, increasing the mucosal structure, the tight junctions in the epithelium, getting those keystone species up. All of those are features of a gut that isn't leaky and isn't allowing endotoxemia. It's your microbiome that's protecting you from that endotoxemia.
Brilliant. Is there anything else that you want to kind of touch on from a sort of an intervention perspective?
Yeah, stress management is critical, right? We talked about how stress can compromise your stomach acid, which then, of course, allows more of these oral gram-negative bacteria to make their way into the small intestine in a viable state and start the process of taxa shifting in the small intestine. Stress does other things as well. Stress creates an increase, of course, of corticosteroids and release of things like cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and so on. What is so interesting is that there are opportunistic microbes in your system that are designed by evolution to read and detect those stress hormone levels in your system. And when they detect an elevated levels of those stress hormones, that's when they turn on their virulence genes. That's part of the reason why they're called opportunistic, because they don't turn on their virulence genes all the time. They look for certain opportunities to do it. They've learned over the course of evolution, when the stress hormone levels are elevated in the host, it means that the host immune system is compromised. And so that's their best shot at proliferating, right? So as you are undergoing stress and you're increasing the stress hormones, then you've got these microbes sitting in your system, including viruses, that start to proliferate because of the elevation of stress hormones. So when they start to proliferate, they cause dysbiosis. Right now, that resistance factor in the gut is becoming compromised because you've got a certain set of bacteria that are highly motivated to proliferate. Then as you start getting more of those bacteria growing, they actually induce more stress because that creates a condition in which they thrive, right? So some of the organisms that proliferate in the presence of stress can actually produce neurotransmitters that they send up the enteric nervous system, up the vagus nerve to the brain, to create more stress and panic response in the individual, right? That's why we see stress and panic disorders as a progressive issue, right? It's not that like, oh, I'm just kind of stressed all the time. It typically gets worse over time, right? And so that whole activation of the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, is done in two formats. One is our own stress triggers an inflammatory response. One of the first things that occurs when we get elevated in our stress levels is your macrophages and dendritic cells start sending out inflammatory signals, right? Because the immune system goes, holy crap, our stress levels are high. That means opportunistic pathogens are going to start proliferating. So in order to try to control that, we need to release more inflammatory markers to recruit the immune system, right? So with stress, inflammation goes up. As inflammation goes up, the gut becomes leakier and more gram-negative bacteria and more dysbiotic bacteria are allowed to grow. So it's a self-perpetuating cycle. So mindfulness and doing mindfulness work to control your own stress can be profoundly powerful.
Amazing. Yeah. It's unsurprising now how many of these sort of systems and pathways are kind of bidirectional, as you're kind of describing there.
Yeah, absolutely. They all work on a lot of these feedback loops, right? Because again, the entire body is connected. One of the big faults of modern medicine is putting different parts of the body in silos, right? As if the brain is not connected to the heart, as if the heart's not connected to your joints, as if your joints is not connected to your liver, because we've got these specialists in different parts of the body, and all they're doing is focusing on that one organ, and that creates this misnomer that disease is organ-based rather than systemic, right?
Yeah.
And systems biology is the most critical aspect of it. And all of this has feedback mechanisms. As I mentioned, a leaky component of your gut is going to perpetuate leakiness because it keeps driving inflammatory response that compromises the integrity of the barrier in adjacent structures. And as that barrier becomes more compromised, it increases inflammation even more, which makes even more leakiness in other parts of the body, right? So these are cycles that we create for ourselves. So imagine your typical person that's listening to this interview. They are likely stressed, maybe because of their job or their personal life or a combination of the two. In order to overcome that stress, they're doing things like going out later, having drinks, maybe, doing recreational drugs, staying up, watching TV, doing all of these things that then compromise their ability to sleep and repair, and actually increases the physiological stress within their system. All of that, all the while, is compromising the gut microbiome. Their diet is shrinking. They're getting less exercise. They're getting out less. They're working at home a lot more in front of the computer. All of these things perpetuate the dysfunctions that we've been talking about, right? So what we need to do is be very prescriptive and add into our routine small little things that are going to help us break that cycle, because everything is this continuous cycle of dismantling of our system, right?
Yeah.
And all the things we talked about are small. You could take a probiotic every day. That's easy. Take one, of course, that like the megaspore that's been studied in leaky gut. You can take a prebiotic. You can increase your diet, the diversity in your diet quite easily. You can download an app and listen to a meditation 5 minutes for 5 minutes before going to bed, and do that as the first thing you do when you wake up for the first 5 minutes of the day, right? Those are simple things you can do to just start making a change and break that cycle.
Mm.